Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, you won't see the show on your TV, so we talk about things musically. Cause you're listening to Jams and Tea, listening to Jams and Tea.
Welcome everybody to a new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast Record Club, where this week we are going to be covering my recommended album, which is, well, technically an album, but more a compilation of several EPs released over the course of a decade by acclaimed IDM artist Burial. We have Tunes 2011 to 2019. This is a 2.5 hour long project. I don't have it on vinyl because I don't think it exists in its entirety, but I do have one of the EPs in question with me. I have Burial's, Beach Fires and Subtemple right here as the little visual aid. So that's nifty. But Tyler, why don't you introduce to us who Burial even are?
Okay, well, Burial is one person for starters, so we don't need to use the group. Whatever the class of word that is.
Moniker.
Yes, so Burial is William Bevan, a British-based electronic music producer. We can get kind of into label-y stuff. I mean, a lot of people would argue that none of Burial's music is technically IDM, although it's really semantics when you get down to it. The genres he's typically associated with are future garage and dubstep. And those are both genres which in the most distilled and pure form appear on this compilation, in addition to quite heavy use of ambient music as well. So a lot of it is rooted in kind of like the British sort of rave scene of the 2000s, which itself is obviously a vestige of a much more active sort of dance scene in the UK during the 90s, in which a lot of classic music emerged. And the electronic music scene in the UK in the 90s was much more about kind of like drugs and acid and creating these bizarre and huge, bright, vibrant dance sounds. You give acts like Underworld, for example, come to mind, and a lot of sort of rave acts that were kind of and that was also the scene in which the IDM emerged as kind of like the even more underground counterpoint to that. And we obviously talked about classic IDM like Autechre and Square Pusher and Aphex Twin. We've talked to them, that kind of thing, to death on the podcast before. But I think to set the scene, it's important to understand what the scene that Burial is a part of emerged. And so the 2000s were a much darker time. That kind of style of rave driven music and sort of bright club stuff kind of grew out of style a little bit and became kind of more entangled in things like the grime scene and a kind of grittier style of music as well, more homemade and less polished. And then so there was a lot of music in the style of things like two-step and garage and dub, and they were all kind of circled around or oriented around. Much of it was oriented around the Hyperdub label, which the majority of Burial's music was released through. And Burial kind of in the mid-2000s emerged as kind of a central figure, or at least one of the most beloved and iconic features of this sort of wave of music. And what was really significant was Burial's 2007 album Untrue, which was Burial's second album, and to date he has not released a studio record since then. And it was an immediately beloved and acclaimed record. It was shortlisted for the Mercury Prize, and I believe in 2016, Pitchfork called it the most important electronic album of the century so far, which I think is deserving accolade. It's
a great album.
It's a remarkable record. It's incredibly concise and consistent, only about 50 minutes, even shorter on vinyl. And it has also notably been incredibly influential on certain sort of home producers and a darker, more ethereal style of dance music that's very kind of moody and associated with kind of like nightlife and nocturnal scenes. And again, super UK and feel as well, English. And so after Untrue, there was a lot of kind of speculation about where would Burial go next? Like, what would be the move? How do you kind of follow up something like Untrue, and how do you develop that sound, especially in a world where you have a lot of people who have co-opted it, who are doing their own spins on it, who are developing it in their own way? And Burial, although initially prolific in the mid-2000s, definitely slowed down after the release of Untrue, and didn't really drop very much until the 2010s. I think specifically the first major release after Untrue was the Street Halo EP in 2011, which is the earliest release chronicled on this compilation that we're going to discuss today. And there was specifically a string of EPs between 2011 and 2013, Street Halo, Kindred, Truant, and Rival Dealer, which make up the bulk of this release, that were widely heralded as by many musical outlets and fans as an incredible advancement and development of the earlier sound, more progressive in terms of the way that the songs were structured into these lengthier, digressive pieces, and also just generally like quite ambitious stuff. And then kind of after that, Burial slowed down again between 2014 and 2019, occasionally releasing double-sided singles and very little else. And during that period, because to give some context, I became a Burial fan in 2012, actually, around the time that Kindred and Truant were released in that same year. And so I've kind of been on the Burial train for a while, and I feel kind of blessed to have experienced the hype around those things as it was happening. It was
you
massive.
were on the ground floor then, weren't you?
Oh, I mean, certainly Burial was established by the time I discovered his stuff, but it was, I think, perhaps difficult now to quite appreciate how huge those releases were in the alternative music scene. These were not EPs that were overlooked and have suddenly been amazingly recontextualized here in this compilation. These were EPs that were immediately heralded as some of the best electronic music of the time. But it was interesting in the second half of the decade where Burial really slowed down and stopped releasing music, and the music that was coming out was much more kind of ambient and reflective and minimal. And people were sort of like thinking, well, what's happening to Burial? Has he kind of lost his luster? Has he lost interest in making music? Has he lost the spark? Where are these? What has happened to this incredibly ambitious and complex style that was happening on those earlier EPs? And then in 2019, shortly after releasing the Claustro and State Forest double-sided single, Burial announced and then released this compilation, which brings together almost everything that was released under the Hybrid label between 2011 and 2019. The only thing that's missing is another single called Rodent, which is also very good, but evidently Burial didn't feel as though it fit on this compilation.
Total of 17 songs.
But yeah, we do have 17 songs here that add up to 2.5 hours of music. And immediately what is striking about it is the way that the music itself is recontextualized by the structuring of this project. When it first dropped, there was a lot of confusion and surprise at the way that the music that had been regarded as subpar or less striking from the more recent years has been foregrounded here at the beginning of the record, and gives the whole project a new context. And I think that the way this is structured and the way that this flows is a stroke of genius. And I look forward to getting into why that is in detail, because I think to me, the way this is structured is very evocative of a particular kind of narrative progression in both the sound and the imagery and ideas and themes that it all evokes. So how do you want to do this, Jake? Do you want to launch into your thing first, or?
I have sort of a, just more unstructured thoughts about this, and I will say that, the structure, as you implied, is basically key as to why I wanted to talk about this record in the first place, because, a compilation just sort of implies that it is an assembly of songs, just because that's traditionally what a compilation is. However, here, for all intents and purposes, I treat this as if it were an album release. I treat this as if it is supposed to be taken piece by piece. If you, if you hit shuffle on this album, I think you would be missing a key integral part of the experience that this is. And it's not as if it's sequenced like in any kind of chronological order of release or anything. This is something that Burial clearly wanted this to be experienced like. Otherwise, I mean, like, why even bother doing it at all?
Yeah.
So I feel like the progression is inherent to that, and I especially think that just because it starts with the 3 sort of track run of State Forest, Beach Fires, and Subtemple, which are the notably 3 most ambient pieces on it, and then it sort of stretches into being more of traditionally what I think you would expect from this particular artist. But just as a whole, I'd say that one of the core appeals of this album, other than it being really evocative of the tone, imagery, and atmosphere of the nighttime, something very nocturnal, I would very much recommend, if you're going to listen to this, please do it at night. It's that kind of it's like Deftones. It's just sort of an album and vibe that you can best appreciate in darkness. And also another ideal way to experience it, listen to it outside. Go and walk around and like experience the world at night if you can. If I know that's not exactly something that's easily available to everybody, but like if you can do that, it is amazing. It is remarkable. I would highly recommend that. And I just think that the strength of this record, other than maybe its just remarkable versatility in terms of the genres that it covers, the sounds, the soundscapes, the sampling, just everything that it has going for it, is really that it is how like inherently textural it is. This was an album that I sort of listened to. This was sort of my gateway into this kind of music in general. When we first met, you had been really championing this, and I just, on a whim one night, I listened to this right after I listened to the most recent Lingua Ignota album. That was a fun night. But it was just sort of it was a eye-opening experience for me, as I just got to expose myself to like every facet of what this world of music is capable of. I feel like this covers so many, like, you know, we can't exclusively call Burial IDM. We can't even strictly call him IDM. But just this gives you, I feel like, a little bit of everything. And it does so while feeling seamless, while feeling like a natural progression, without feeling like it's gesturing at ideas, without feeling like it's not capturing something. But I just think that the production here is astounding. And it really, like, it's eye-opening too when you think it's like, this is a compilation of things, and the production of everything, this, whether or not it was released in 2011 or 2019, it all flows and feels cohesive, and it's all absurdly well produced. And it's just like, you know, get a good pair of headphones and just soak this in, because like there's the sort of vinyl crackling on some of the tracks here that just feels so pleasant to the ears. It's a very raw, a very immediate sort of listen that just sort of exposes you to these samples and these sort of cycling beats that happen, these sort of dance beats as you really like get into it, and it eases you in so perfectly. And the actual sound of everything is crisp, it is clear, it is beautiful, and not for a single moment is it like, does it take you out of it. It's just this all-encompassing, immersive thing. And that is what you will be getting into with this record. That is what you should expect.
Yeah, 100% agree. Burial was a master of sound design. I know his name is William Bevan, but like I just it feels easy. It feels right to call him Burial because a thing about again, another historical thing is that Burial kept his identity a secret for a long time, or tried to.
Really?
In the 2000s, like he I think up to and including the release of Untrue, his identity was completely unknown. And it was discovered, I believe, by some journalist outfit, newspaper, and then eventually Burial himself confirmed it or Hyperdub confirmed it. And then around the time Rival Dealer was released, I remember this very vividly. Burial actually released took a selfie and released like a statement saying, thank you for one of his first statements saying, thank you for all the love and listening to the music. And memorably in the statement, he never once used the words tracks, songs, or even albums or EPs or anything else. He described it all as tunes. That was just the word he used.
Interesting.
The word he used to describe his music, and consistently. And so that, I think, that is where the title of this compilation has come from. Is that Burial doesn't think of his music as like these shifting progressive works or songs or soundscapes, just tunes.
Like doesn't take himself super seriously, which I think is admirable when you're releasing a project like this. And as such, I think it's as like Tyler and I have sort of written, because this is the kind of music that it is, I feel like if we went about it in like the detail of like track by track and just sort of describing what it is doesn't really do it justice. And it also kind of ruins the surprise of this album to you, just because it is such a dynamic and shifting piece of because like, as Tyler said, these are pieces with lots of digressions. They go places, they shift, they move. And that part of the appeal of the record is doing that. So I think we've decided to take a little bit less of a direct approach in writing about it, and just sort of gone for something a bit more like evocative, I guess is the word that
I'm glad you say that, but I am going to describe it track by track actually. But it's
I am too.
It's certainly going to be. I'm trying in my descriptions to both capture the sound as well as the feeling, and I'm presuming that most of the people who are watching this all the way through are already familiar with the music. Anyway, but even if you're not, you should still. The video should still make sense. But I think that having the reference point of the music will make the video a lot clearer. And what we talk about a lot clearer. But yeah, so do you want to do your thing first? Do you want to do your track by track first?
Sure, I can. I was really pretentious about this, and I decided to, the thing about how I process this music is I imagine, it's like Autechre. I imagine it directly fuels an ongoing picture in my head. So I just sort of wrote the images, feelings, and atmosphere that is evoked in my head as a narrative progression, because as Tyler sort of insinuated, I think there is a narrative progression to the music here that is, while abstract, is still enough to like push towards like some sort of unified vision. I feel like there is still enough here to go on that enough people would just be like, oh, I have like some similarities of what I imagine here. So basically, it's how I describe it is mostly as like a story in first person. So here we go. We kick off with track State Forest. And State Forest is a track where I feel like I am floating in a large vertical cavern. I am staring upward at the night sky, and abyssal darkness is beneath me. And the sound of an otherworldly siren is calling out to me, reverberating around the walls of the cave and cascading over me. I am suspended, slowly sinking down into the darkness, and the sky is getting further away. And it continues until it swallows me whole, and I reach the bottom, still in darkness. And it's sort of this, that sound of the reverberating around this like monolithic thing is what I think is most evocative of State Forest as a track. It is something that makes you feel like you are at the center of something. And it also gets to the ingenious sound engineering here that I feel like it sort of takes advantage of the mix so beautifully by just trying to round it all out, and you sort of like, it just takes advantage of it wall to wall. Like I would love to be able one day at least to hear all of this on vinyl the way I have with some of it, just because like the less compressed it is, the more just absolutely like breathtaking it is. And that goes into Beach Fires. And Beach Fires is a track where suddenly I see light. My surroundings are that of a cave with winding infinite passageways with glittering, twinkling gemstones in the walls, and the moonlight is somehow reflected in them from the top. And it creates waves of strange light that go along the walls like a pulse, like it's a living, breathing thing. And I wander about, lost, turning and walking with no direction, and I hear ghostly cries in the distance, and the sound of knives being sharpened, leading me to want to escape whatever I found myself in, as something sinister and ominous lurks in the shadows. Eventually, I'm brought to a passageway that becomes a tunnel, as I am at the bottom of a monolithic-looking cathedral with 100-foot-high stained glass windows, footsteps echoing as I'm the only one there. And this goes into Subtemple, one of my favorite pieces on the record. I explore the mysterious place and find myself lost, and I exit it and see myself amidst a vast forest. And I do feel like this is not just me projecting here. I feel like there is a progression in terms of location with the sounds here, the sort of emptiness of a cave, and then there's sort of the rich ambience of a forest that eventually, like, it sort of spans these different locations and eventually goes into a city. Do you view that as the case too, just in terms of like settings and imagery? Because I feel like there is a very definite attempt to capture something a bit more concrete with how the progression sounds. I wondered if you maybe thought the same.
Yes, definitely. I think to me the whole thing has that same kind of urban feel, like desolate cityscapes, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time you can also see some of the tracks early in the record as more evocative of something more barren and empty. But I'll get into that in my analysis anyway.
Okay. And I don't also just imagine a forest just because of the ambience. I also do it just because some of the samples here I actually recognized immediately from being the video game The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, which is primarily does take place in like forest-like locations. It sort of evokes this dark, murky, mystical kind of place, which instantly, like, if I can easily describe it to people who don't know what it feels like, this opening segment of the record is very reminiscent of like a darker Legend of Zelda game. And let's see. In Subtemple, I said I exit the place and I go to a vast forest. And I pass by a strange group of people who look as if they're performing a massive ritual baptism next to a river, chanting, swaying back and forth as if under some kind of hypnosis. And this is the moment on the album where, you know, the human voice has started to show its head a little bit more and to be used in more of the samples. I only observe from afar as I'm afraid that they may harm me because there's something vaguely sinister about the air. After each baptism I see, the person disappears from the water without warning, vanishing completely, which is sort of evoked by a lot of the sounds here being this sort of splashy sort of electronic hit that just abruptly ends very suddenly, which just sort of evokes that feeling of form and then dissonance. Young Death, I move forward, continuing on, and I build a fire to keep warm in the cold of night. However, I hear something in the distance that seems to call me forward. This time, it's another group of people. But however, it's different. They all surround a large bonfire, dancing around it joyously. They wear reflective clothing that the light bounces off of from the fire, pulling me forward until I join them. And then time slows down to a crawl. And it's at this point on the record where the sort of dancier parts of it come into play. There's sort of a backing beat that's a bit more driving, that's sort of a bit more indicative of Burial's music and music that you'd find in the genre as a whole. But I find that on this record specifically, it's a bit more meditative. It's not as immediately like danceable. It's a bit more like, I don't know how to describe it. It's progressive, meditative, but also energetic. And it's very emotionally evocative, I find. And it's sort of like there's a slowness to the end of the track that I find really compelling, and how it sort of evolves from that digression. Night market, the fire goes out and the people around me vanish completely. They turn into mist that's absorbed by the ground. I'm startled and run from the clearing. Above me, it looks like the stars in the sky have begun to shine brighter, and I slow down, taking in the sight as comets illuminate the sky overhead, while light shining down as each of them burns out. Sort of like a bright, shimmering quality that just sort of, again, fades out and sort of fades in, fades out, fades in, fades out, just making this really compelling struggle happening on the track. And on a lot of them, too. There's just so many electronic ideas that sort of clash into each other and like battle for supremacy in an almost jazz-like kind of way. Hiders, another huge highlight on a record full of highlights. After walking more, I ultimately reached what looks like another congregation, people holding candles as they look towards a wooden stage. However, it's not a preacher or a religious figure standing there, but the specter of a ghost performing a song that sounds like it's coming in from a different world entirely, hearing words and sounds that my brain can't fully comprehend. It's overwhelmingly emotional, but it's also comforting and reassuring to sort of counteract the menace and sinister lurking that you can find in the soundscapes of the previous songs on the record. There is a sort of reassuring comfort and love that you even feel as if you were looking to the face of someone you trust here. The loneliness and fear from before has melted away, and in its place, sort of security and comfort. And then you have Come Down to Us. The crowd once again vanishes in the blink of an eye, and I'm left in the darkness of the forest once again, comets faintly illuminating the sky still. I now encounter the edge of the forest that rests on the rim of an enormous cityscape. Giant buildings tower over me, and nightlife buzzes with activity. I explore the unknown location. Huge multicolored advertisements straight out of Blade Runner illuminate the streets in different waves of light. Vehicles travel by, people walk past me, and I just observe with no destination in mind. It is a hub of underground culture that feels totally alien, even vaguely futuristic in nature. There's still, however, a vaguely threatening aura and ominousness to it all. Claustro. I go into an underground nightclub of sorts, inundated with a mass sensory overload. It's like you can smell and taste the alcohol and sweat in the air. The lights, pulsating music, it's absolutely overpowering. I can only stare at the people involved from the edge of a massive room where this all takes place. Rival dealer. I exit for a gasp of air to let myself breathe, and it begins to rain. I go around aimlessly in the streets, dwarfed by the buildings around me, so large that they could be deities. I go around into a subway, hop onto the trains, and try to escape the impending helplessness of feeling small, and anxiety begins to manifest. Everywhere it looks the same wherever I get out, and I don't know where I'm going. I just keep riding trains until I get to a suitable location. Eventually, I arrive at the outskirts of the city, and I sit at the edge of a sidewalk, staring out to a vast ocean in the night sky. Filled with a sense of visual awe, I just relax as I climb up a small building with a roof that allows for a better view. I find this track really compelling just because of how it is structured. It's one of the more progressive songs on this compilation. I feel like there is a lot of that tension, anxiety, and that sort of dueling sense of clashing elements in the middle of it that really is evocative of something like anxiety. And then that final third of the track is just really meditative and calm, and you can sort of get out of it. And there's sort of some vocal samples here that tend to imply a sense of calmness and peace. You get those occasionally, just sort of a vocal sample of someone talking, and it's sort of evocative of the mood that you're currently experiencing. Then it goes to Kindred. And the rain drizzles as I wander through the streets again. The nightlife seems to have died down a bit. However, I can't escape the feeling that something is following me again. Footsteps that faintly echo mine drawing close. I turn corners and pick up my pace to shake whatever is following me, but it proves difficult. This is another song where that sort of sense of anxiousness is amplified. I think the beat here is sort of menacing, and it sort of propels it forward in a really compelling way. And then we have Loner. is I managed to outrun whatever followed me, and the rain finally stops. There's a sense of stillness in the music here. But suddenly, the city goes from quiet to silent. I am now walking through what feels like a massive graveyard in near total darkness. Then we get to another highlight of the compilation, Ashtray Wasp. Suddenly, everything illuminates, and now the city is swathed in light. It feels like an entirely different world. The lights commingle and interact, refracting, changing colors. People come up from subway tunnels and out of buildings as if it were daytime. It's overwhelming, but peaceful in a sense. It feels warm, as if everything around you is filling you up and surrounding you, cascading. Then we have Rough Sleeper. I get in a cab, and I see the world around me like it's once again in slow motion. Streams of light trail before me, faces of people I don't recognize on every street corner. Music playing from underneath subways, rising out and faintly echoing into the streets, which I think is perfectly evoked by the distant sounding samples of brass instruments that sort of echo as this track goes on. You can sort of hear the sound of like street performers who would be standing on the edge of the street with like a saxophone and like an open case for their instrument where people could toss money into it. Truant, I exit the cab, and curiously, I find myself at an intersection where there's no one again. There's a loneliness here. I enter a large, mysterious building that looks like some sort of nocturnal art gallery. The displays are fluid, constantly morphing and changing into different shapes and colors. No one is there with me, and only the light from the outside illuminates what I see. I ascend the building, which feels like it has an infinite, never-ending amounts of floor and stairs. There's a spaciousness to the sound here, which almost evokes the earlier parts of the record, but it's still a bit more claustrophobic. Street halo is where I reach the top of the building, head out onto the roof, and I can see people dancing, partying on other rooftops. From a distance, though, generally having a good time, and I can only observe them. Stolen Dog, I take a newly discovered elevator back down to the street and walk around once more. I can see people now, but they're translucent. Like I'm seeing memories and echoes through this strange city happen all at once. It's overwhelming, and I try to move so quickly so that I'm not inundated with such a bizarre sight and odd, distorted sounds. There's an ethereal quality that I find unsettling and honestly like scary about the end of this. And then finally, the last track, NYC, I enter a parking garage and curiously find my own car here, and I drive out of it. I see everything I've encountered throughout this bizarre trip, zipping down streets, curiously alongside no other vehicles. It's just me. I feel myself drifting in and out of consciousness, trying to keep myself awake as it sort of fades in and fades out from channel to channel. And I finally hit the city limits and drive home, hoping to get sleep into complete and utter darkness until it fades out and the record ends. So that's the kind of thing that I think it evokes in you when you listen to something like this, which, you know, obviously could be different from everybody, but I think that sort of impressionistic view is what makes records like this so incredibly special. And the music is so specifically evocative of certain things in this sort of environment, and it captures it so fucking well. It has led me to listen to this 2.5 hour long record more times than I can count in the years since I first discovered it, which is, I mean, like, what better compliment can I give something than that?
Yeah. So your story and your progression is very evocative, and there's some similarities with mine, but thankfully it's actually, mine's a little bit different. Although
Good.
yeah, there are definitely some similarities. So I will try in my analysis to capture a little bit more what the sound of the record actually is as well, and why certain sounds remind me of certain things. But yeah, it's just you've said it. You've hit the nail on the head when you say that it is incredibly evocative, and by design as well. I think the use of deployment of vocal samples, found sounds, particular noises is definitely intentionally intended to put you in a particular headspace or a particular location or a particular emotional setting that you can kind of project your own reality onto. So yeah, to me, these are not just a set of disconnected tracks that are arranged to flow as well as possible. I mean, superficially they are that, but collectively they add up to something more transporting, more linear. The narrative that I have when I discuss this record is not necessarily like a very specifically detailed one. It's a bit ephemeral, but it definitely, there is a progression to it that matches the way the album is constructed as well. For the first 40 minutes, Burial constructs soundscapes in front of you, gradually adding and taking away element by element from the mixes until the scene is set. It is almost like you are watching, as this record progresses, it is almost like you are watching music evolve, watching music slowly construct itself from a formless bass to a detailed, layered, and incredibly intricate arrangements.
It goes from being really like primordial. This is going to sound super pretentious, but it goes from being so base and primordial in a way to going to become so evolved. It's almost like you're watching the progression of like civilization.
Yeah, no, that definitely, I think, is something that is evoked from me as well. Like, and I think that, you know, sometimes you have to just say fuck it as to whether you're being pretentious and just say how you feel, and that's definitely it. Like, it is definitely like you're watching the evolution of some kind of world through various eras. So We're Untrue cast the nocturnal London as a place of loss and heartbreak for Britain's forgotten. Tunes is a brighter and wider canvas, where I think the entire spectrum of human emotion is expressed, as its nameless characters with their disembodied voices search for meaning, for happiness, for forgiveness, and for acceptance. State Forest is like being lost in a vast emptiness. It's with only the night sky to guide you. You could be in the middle of a deserted London park staring at the lights of the city, or you could be in the bathroom of a club, high out of your mind, seeing yourself outside of yourself. In the musical language of this record and of the scenes that it evokes, there is no difference between laying face up in an alleyway or being sprawled in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Either way, looking up, you see the stars. Beach Fires takes the tranquility of that opener and it supplants it with an urgent emotionality. The gigantic waves of sound that crest across its 10 minutes are nothing short of overwhelming. And aside from the occasional deeply embedded bass pulses, Burial has still yet to introduce a beat on this album. The arc of this opening stretch is in this way like witnessing the birth of rhythm and slow motion. It's like each track is a geological era, and the wider world of the album is advancing to a new period with each new piece. Burial uses found sounds, vocal snippets, the slow and manipulated low ticking of a clock, and washes of formless noise to add further layers to the third track, Subtempo. And slowly, the album's world begins to unfurl further. The pieces have not yet cohered into what we would think of traditionally as music, but the mixes are growing denser, more elements are piling in, and the pad-heavy textural bliss of the beginning already feels like a distant memory. We get the first hint of a steady beat with the low pulses of Young Death, which matches it with these gorgeous melodic tones that feel like a warm hug as the vocal samples go from fragmented, formless snippets to clearer intonements of love. I will always be there for you. The start-stop progression of Night Market is more complex still, but not quite a full arrival, with siren-like synths blaring across the track's second half and heralding the climax of the first major arc of this record. To me, what these first 6 or so tracks are, it's like you're wandering through the wilderness, through a vast expanse of nothingness, and you're gradually stumbling towards a cityscape of neon lights and vibrant life. With the
I love
arrival,
that similarity is between us. And we didn't like discuss this beforehand. That's
yeah.
just like a commonality that this has just because it's so fucking good at it.
Yes, exactly. With the arrival of the blossoming and uplifting hiders, the record snaps into focus, and we get the first major beat of the album towards the end here. It's a drum sample that actually sounds a little bit clumsy in the second half of the track, but in the context of the record, it's almost endearing how jaggedly it fits into the mix. The gradual push through subdued mixes towards the first hints of rhythm throughout the record's first act here sees the actual arrival of a punctual beat. It's more a hint towards the full embrace of clattering, danceable garage that will dominate the record's second half than an arrival there. And it serves as yet another step in the narrative progression. The arrival of the conventional clattering rhythm is clunky, is a bit strange, but it's just because the album itself is getting used to this new step in its development. It's strange how well that fits, because I never used to be like super massive on hiders as a track, but here it segues into this new sound of the record so well. And really how it works especially well as merely an intro to the next track, and one of the most significant pieces on the album. Come Down to Us is the first of a number of sweeping multi-section 10 plus minute tracks, and it's one of the most plainly beautiful pieces that Burial has ever composed. And all of a sudden, it's as though the anxiety and bubbling tension of the record's first stretch has finally eased away entirely. We have a beat that is steady, supportive, underlying a bedrock of dreamlike synths, ambient noise, crickets, and snatches of encouraging vocal snippets saying things such as, "Don't be afraid," "Let yourself go," "Tonight you feel alive," and "This is the moment when you see who you are." If the first stretch of the record is wandering through an isolated, cold landscape of disenfranchised loners racked with anxiety and fear, this track is discovering a community of people who feel likewise, to whom you can belong and experience love, support, and validation. This is the point at which the atmosphere and vibe of the project veers from the more singular range of untrue to something new and wider in scope. The inclusion of a sample of Lana Wachowski speaking on behalf of the trans community at the 2012 Human Rights Campaign Gala ties the theme of support in this track to the queer community explicitly, who Burial spoke in a press release that the Rival Dealer EP, which it belongs to, was specifically dedicated to them. And so following this warm and loving embrace on Come Down to Us, you get the sensual and fast-paced claustro, which invites you in from the cold to dance and share in a more intimate human connection, with that repeated lyric of "I want you, I know you want me." It's the most singular track on the record. Nothing else really sounds like it. And it also disrupts the backward moving chronology of the sequencing too, because it's a 2019 track surrounded on either side by songs from a 2013 EP. It's a genius move though, because it serves as a superb segue from the glowing beat of Come Down to Us to the heaviest and most industrial and musically dense track on the record, which is the superbly dark Rival Dealer. Here, the intimate club experience turns intense and explosive. We've come a long way from the beatless first stretch, as Disc 1 climaxes with a heavy drum and bass influenced percussive loop, alongside these ghostly wails that almost sound like screeching tires lathered in effects. To me, in terms of the narrative of the record, this shift is like being in the midst of a loving and sensual experience and then becoming seized by your insecurities, your self-loathing, and even homophobia or transphobia, either internalized or hurled at you by observers, driving you away from that person who promises to love you more than anyone, and into a darker night of heavy rain, garish neon lights, and idling traffic. There's even a point halfway through the track where the beat switches up to this gritty, distorted, staticky hum, punctuated by jagged bursts of noise, and that to me simulates stepping out into a seedy, unquiet night populated by unfriendly strangers. However, just shy of 8 minutes into this track, there's another dramatic shift where the music all but halts and these ghostly but almost heavenly synths ease in, and a disembodied voice cries, "I've been watching you. I want to be with you and love you." My favorite single moment of Burial's entire career, and one of my favorite moments in all of music, occurs exactly 9 minutes and 13 seconds into this track, as the mix just breaks open and that same voice lets out this haunting and heavenly cry of love before those amazing synths enter again, louder this time, and another voice comforts our protagonist with the words, "This is the best way to go. You can see the city lights brighter than ever, the stars and the constellations, and one night I saw something come down to us," before the track abruptly cuts into a low bassy echo and then silence. The cumulative effect of this final sequence in the track is like our protagonist, fleeing in shame and fear, is suddenly stopped in her tracks by an angelic encounter beneath the illumination of a streetlight. If that sounds a bit corny or cheesy, then Burial doesn't care. It's real, and it's unafraid to be wholly emotional in a way that does tend to read as cheesy to those of us for whom this kind of endearing and unabashed directness has been soured by a landscape of lazy and one-dimensional media portrayals. I believe that sense of an angelic encounter, of being rescued in the midst of your worst moment by something greater than you can even understand, is totally intentional on Burial's part, and it turns a track whose darkness might otherwise be overwhelming and even out of place into yet another thorn in an emotional narrative depicting the experience of London's forgotten, of the world's forgotten, and a celebration of their existence and their beauty. The second disc begins with the Kindred EP, the only major EP whose tracks are sequenced here in exactly the order of its original release. It's also, in my opinion, the best EP that Burial ever released. And to be frank, it's actually my favorite EP of all time. The title track introduces this absolutely classic, enduring dubstep beat that clanks and pulses. And to me, that beat will always be the first sound I think of when I think of Burial. It's simple, it's repetitive, but I think it's the strongest and most essentially perfect beat he ever made. And I'm perhaps biased in thinking that in a sense because it was the first Burial song I ever heard, but it just has that classic feel to me. It takes more than a good beat to make a great tune, though. And what really elevates the track is how Burial gradually, piece by piece, builds up the layers of atmosphere, melody, tone, and emotion of the track through evocatively chopped vocal samples and waves of ambience and effects. It, in fact the entire EP as a whole, evokes perfectly the atmosphere of cold, rainy urban nights where it's eternally 3 a.m. and you're forever walking home, clouded by substances but grimly aware of the uncertainty and doom that the night brings. In terms of the record's narrative, it's easy to see the central figure, to whom all the vocal snippets across the album are directed in second person, awakening from their angelic encounter to a grimly silent and raining cityscape. That use of second person imperatives and assurances in this track, lines like "Baby, you are the light," reinforce the notion that the narrative Burial seeks to build with the way these tracks are put together and interconnect centers the listener themselves as the protagonist. And the aim is to tap into some kind of deeply felt and shared emotional experiences that will let each listener construct their own narrative or find their own relevance. Loner's more urgent melodic arpeggios bring the darkness of Rival Dealer back, but it's less oppressive and less violent, and it's more like stumbling from the suburbs to the motorway, assaulted by flashes of speeding cars and blinking lights. I think maybe the best feeling of the world is listening to this while driving through a city lit by neon in the middle of a Saturday night, where a sense of apocalyptic clamor hangs over the world outside your car. Ashtray Wasp is my favorite Burial track to date. It's yet another piece of moody, ethereal garage dub that pulses with an emotional urgency and even a sense of forlorn regret. I need you. I used to belong to you. The track moves through various sections, each of which are kind of burned into my brain. There are so many fantastic details here. The surging siren-like guitar sample that bursts and bleeds across the mix for 10 short seconds, around 4.5 minutes in. The way the beat shuffles steadily, but also kind of subtly shifts across the runtime. And the way the vocal samples are often wordless and purely evocative, haunted howls into the night. Around 7.5 minutes in, the track shifts completely to this smoother, more minimal section that sounds honestly quite hopeless and kind of scary. The musical elements are almost pure bass, and the vocals are manipulated and pitch shifted to sound inhuman but still tangibly emotional. There's a repeated loop of "I love you" that just wrecks me. And then finally, in the last 2 minutes of the track, it shifts again. And Burial introduces my favorite combination of sounds that he has ever released. There's this chopped up but really potent piano loop, and there's also what sounds like the clinking of a spoon against a mug, looped and manipulated to form a melody. And there's this I can't really describe why it's so beautiful, but there's this really masterful bit of vocal sampling and editing. And the way that these three elements, the piano loop, that clinking sample, and the vocal samples, the way they combine and kind of roll off on top of each other, and you atop this kind of bedrock of vinyl crackle, there's just something about it. It just really destroys me. And I can't really explain why, it just does. And I think these 2 minutes alone are worth the whole album. It's the loneliest sound in the world. And
it evokes being in a diner all alone at 3 a.m. while you sit there and listen to some old jazz music.
Yeah, and also just the title, like Ashtray Wasp, is just such an image. Like, you just think of it's such a beautiful title for this piece. And like what it makes me think of is it makes me think of like countless nights in like high school when I was walking home drunk from a party or whatever, listening to this EP and hearing this track and just kind of feeling the rain on me.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't exactly an amazing time for me then, but looking back from now, I realized those were some of the best moments of my whole life, and I never really fully appreciated how lucky I was to have them. And it just all comes flooding back whenever I listen to this. It's just, that's the kind of thing you want for music, I guess, or like the best thing music can do, I suppose. Rough Sleeper comes next, and that was released the same year as the Kindred EP in 2012. It's another lengthy piece that I think actually evokes similar feelings to a lot of the Kindred EP, but the crucial difference is that here, and for the rest of the compilation, we move away from the more urgent and pulsing clatter of its midsection to a subtler and less beat-heavy, more textural and moody final stretch. With Rough Sleeper, we're not quite there yet, but that shift is well underway. This track has less of the rainy, desolate vibe that the previous EP has, and it's almost as though some light is returning that was hinted at throughout the final stretch of Disc 1. The melodies and the vocal samples here are more comprehensible, they're more straightforward, and crucially, they're welcoming again. After the darkness that stretched from Rival Dealer through to Ashtray Wasp, our protagonist is moving towards an acceptance of the validating embrace that she experienced earlier in the night, and more pointedly, to an acceptance of herself. The vocal samples are no longer like mostly oriented around some kind of external force loving you, and they're more about encouraging you to love yourself. I think of lines like "trust the light surrounding you," a disembodied voice coos at multiple points. And then honestly, one of the most powerful words on the whole album, a word that cuts with a devastating simplicity to the heart of the sentiment that we need to hear at our darkest moments, to the notion of support and love and kindness and acceptance that drives the whole record and this whole era of musical output. and the word is stay. It's a vocal sample that he loops countless times throughout this track, and to drive its centrality and its importance to the whole message of the music. Not just to stay here, but to stay who you are. Truant, it was actually the A-side to Rough Sleeper on its original release, but it comes after Rough Sleeper here. And for the most part, it's about as subdued and reflective as the compilation has been since its opening stretch. I think the decision to reverse their order highlights the sequencing smartness of this compilation, as Truant works much better in guiding the record to its final stretch, I think. It's a gorgeous and subtle transition point that isn't quite as immediately gripping as the tracks that precede it, but it still fits as a more minimal example of the slow builds and the gradual layering that's all over a lot of the pieces here. Truant crests around 7 minutes in with this perfect plinking melodic loop that ushers in these huge waves of melodic synths that feel like damn near transcendent for how delayed their arrival is in the track. And then the final stretch is moodier and more discursive, almost creating a sense of tension that leads stupidly well into the first of 3 tracks from the Street Halo EP, the earliest release chronicled on this compilation, and probably the most straightforward and similar to Burial's earlier era. A glorious come down for a lengthy night of dancing, running, and self-discovery. To me, this final stretch is like the arrival home, the sense of settling around the time that the first hints of the glow of a rising sun are teasing the horizon. Particularly evocative is penultimate track, Stolen Dog, which is actually the closer on the original EP, and one of the most kind of tactile pieces on the whole compilation. And what I mean by that is that the soft fuzz of the central melody and basically all its textures feel like you could kind of reach out and touch them and even run your hands along them, like the fur of a dog, which I suppose links back to the title. And the forlorn tone of the pads and the vocal samples give this track something of a bittersweet tone. It's almost like a feeling of lostness. And I understand why he didn't want to end the compilation with it. To me, what this track captures, and again, probably links to an experience I've had with it in the past, is that feeling of kind of like sitting outside your house at like 5 a.m. and almost trying to will the coming day out of existence. The closing track of tunes is NYC, and arguably it's the track on the whole EP that is most directly and tangibly linked to early Burial. And like Kindred and other tracks, it has a classic sounding dub-heavy beat, though here it's less clanking and it's more restrained. To me, it's a final moment of contemplation for the record. The beginning of a new day is slowly arriving and the sky is filled with a foreign natural light, which is like strange and alien compared to the neon glow of the night that you're so used to from the rest of the story. To me, it's like the seeds of dawn are here, that feeling of it. And it's weird because before I heard this compilation, this track never really evoked that for me. It's something that's purely like been done through new context. It's a minimal and it's a sparse ending that I think could initially seem slight compared to some of the stuff that comes before it. But to me, it's kind of like the perfect closer. I can't really imagine any other track on this compilation in its place. Putting the most traditional dubstep and minimal garage sounding track right at the end, to me is like a microcosm of Burial saying goodbye to that past. But it's like a wistful and bittersweet goodbye. If it were kind of like a good riddance, I'm done with you kind of goodbye to that era, he might have placed it earlier. But as the closing note, it seems to be an acknowledgement of the importance of the past in shaping everything that he has become. A reminder of his roots that also reminds us of where he has come from and where he is now. And in terms of the narrative of the album, I like to think it reminds our central character of where she's at, how far she's come, and how much promise the future offers for her. And I hope that wherever she is, she's happy. And yeah, and that's basically how it makes me feel, the way that I go through it. It's like this journey that you're being taken on for 2.5 hours, and it's yeah.
I love that it so vividly does that, and I just feel like there's so many tangible similarities, and that just speaks to the quality of the music so much that it would that it gives you enough to go on like that. And it's just so easy to enjoy. It's so flawlessly constructed. I couldn't dream of having a complaint with it, honestly. It's one of the most like holistic experiences I've ever had with music.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, and you will have already experienced this in the short time you've had with it, like it's a thing that you kind of just age with as well. Like I mean, to me, I've obviously kind of spoke about like how parts of it have soundtracked my like growing up.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, there's just like maybe it's something to do with how like evocative of these scenes the tracks are, but like you kind of link them to a certain experience you might have had when you first heard them, or not even necessarily the first time you heard them, but like a time when you heard them, and it kind of felt like everything you were feeling at that moment was kind
Yeah.
of like there in the music, and it was like
It's like we talked about in the Frightened Rabbit episode.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're but it's even more kind of ephemeral than that, because like you can relate to exactly what Scott's saying on Frightened Rabbit Records, but here it's more like just the sound of it is like sympathetic with the emotions that you're feeling, and it's hard to explain how that works, but and how that is achieved, but it just kind of is. And yeah, and I think the genius of the way this is put together is that while you can kind of get that feeling from a lot of the tracks individually, it's really best expressed when you experience the whole holistic package. The journey, the arc of it is so essential to that feeling, and that's what makes it such a perfect compilation. Like we could talk for ages about like the art of making a compilation. It's something that I've done quite a lot, and it's like, how do you take some songs that have like already got this context that they're linked to, and how do you kind of create a new context without kind of it just feeling like it paling in comparison to the original context, like especially with music you love. How do you kind of make that happen? And you're fortunate in the sense that you didn't have that original context. This is the context they've always had for you, but for me, like, it's like I can double down on what you're saying and say it's doubly impressive because all of these songs had an original context for me, especially this 2011 to 2013 stuff, the Kindred and Street Halo and Truant and Rival Dealer, like that all had its own context for me that was entrenched for years. But here it's like, it just feels like immediately this is what they were made for. They were made to be presented like this. And that's just such an achievement, I think, for music that's so beloved to me and beloved to lots of people, that all of us as longtime Burial fans can like hear this and think, wow, it's like he planned this throughout the whole decade. And I don't know if he did or not, but it's like, it feels like at last, especially with that ambient stuff as well, it feels like at last this all has a place where it belongs and where it adds up to something. And like, it's just so damn good.
Oh, it also just like, I feel like it stands a testament to the power of electronic music and just the overall, it stands against the notion that a lot of people have that like this kind of music is cold or unemotional or like robotic or uninvolved. It's just like, this is a perfect counterpoint. Just be like, this is just so tangibly emotional and taps into something that like not even just general that like most music does, but in ways only it can, which makes it so valuable.
I think that emotional tangibility and connection is something that Burial really kind of actively strives for as well. Like, and it's in the vocal samples, it's in the kind of warmth of a lot of the pads that he uses. It's very clearly like an attempt to make the music welcoming and like a hug, basically. And that's a good sense in which it serves as a really great introduction to this kind of world of sounds, because it welcomes you in, and that's really cool, I think. Yeah. Anything else you want to say, or should we just do our favorite tracks and ratings?
I guess we should do our favorite tracks and ratings, because I'm about tapped out. I mean, it's just like, I know it's 2.5 hours, but like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, it is worth every second of you to find the time to eventually do this and to listen to it all in one go. Like, wait until one night before you go to bed, give yourself a little while, turn off all the lights, and just kind of let this happen.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you will get something out of it.
Yeah. totally agree. Couldn't have said it better. I think we both did the record justice as well. Like, this was really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go first this time for favorite tracks and ratings. My 3 favorite tracks. So yeah, so Ashtray Wasp I already said is my favorite, and I'm gonna stick to that. I'm also gonna pick State Forest, and I'm gonna pick. Oh, this is really tough. I'm gonna pick Rival Dealer as well. I think just because, like I said, it has one of my favorite moments in all of music, and the whole track is just astounding. Yeah, and it gets a strong 10 out of 10 from me. It's one of my 10 favorite albums ever.
And when I met you for a while, this was your favorite album. You listed it that way.
Yeah, exactly. It means as much as any album I've ever heard to me.
I would also agree with that. This is in the upper echelons of my favorites, and it's as perfect as something is capable of being for me. Like, I hate choosing just 3 just because it's all just it's one thing to me, because it's so integral of how it builds into each other. But if I had to just pick the 3 pieces that I like the most, I would have probably said State Forest, but since Tyler said State Forest, I'll try to shout out another track. However, I will say I cannot deny the greatness of Rival Dealer. I'm going to say Rival Dealer just because I also love just the ephemeral nature of that track. I love how it ends. I love how it builds. It's beautiful. It's perfect. I'm going to say Rival Dealer. I'll say I really love the minimal ambience of Beach Fires, and I'll say Come Down to Us as being one of the more patently emotional parts on the record, and it also gets the strongest of 10s for me. Wonderful.
Well, thank you everyone for watching, if you're still with us. So please let us know in the comments below what you think of this compilation, what you think of Burial generally. Is this your favorite Burial release? Do you prefer Untrue? What do you think of our analyses? Do you think our stories are full of shit? Do you have a better narrative, or do you think that the narratives are overblown and it's all just about feeling? Let us know in the comments below. Next week's Record Club is going to be August's pick, which is a jazz album from John Zorn called Spillane. So please stick around for that. And yeah, thank you for watching. Rock over London, rock on Chicago, Future Shop. See what the future has in store.